If you want to learn how to draw, there is one skill you should learn before anything else. It's one of the most important things to know even before you pick up a pencil, and because I'm self-taught, I completely missed it. And that skill is observation. Learning how to see. Some people might be thinking, well, but wait, I already know how to see. I do it all the time. But seeing like an artist is an entirely different thing, so let me explain. Let's say you ask a non-artist to draw a face and give them a reference image. It will probably look something like this. Can you see the main problem with this? Pay attention to the position of the eyes. If you ask that non-artist where they think the eyes are situated on the entire head, they'll probably say somewhere on the upper half of it, right? Because the middle and bottom part are taken up by the nose and mouth. But if you look carefully at a photo, you'll notice that the eyes are almost exactly halfway down the head. Seeing like an artist means being able to observe a reference and draw what you truly see, rather than what you think you see. So how can you do this? With the power of measuring. And I don't mean with the ruler, though I guess you could if you really wanted. But there are slightly more practical ways of going about it. What you're trying to achieve is correct proportions, which means the things that you're drawing are the right size relative to the other things that you're drawing. One way of doing it is starting with an envelope. That is, trying to draw a shape that encloses the object you are drawing. It's easier to tell when shapes are accurate when they're simpler, when there's less to compare. It's also helpful to make light markings before going in with darker lines. This is particularly helpful when you're doing traditional art so that mistakes are easier to correct. In digital art, we have helpful tools like layers and undo to help us out. Another thing you can do is use something you can see as a measuring unit. For example, a common thing to do when drawing human figures is to use the head as a unit. So for this reference, we can see that it's a little less than 7 heads tall. This is actually what artists are doing when they hold their pencils up to a reference. But hang on a second. Isn't this just copying something that already exists? What's the point of this? What if you want to be able to draw something completely original? This is actually exactly the reason I never practice my observation skills a single time, even if I've been drawing for quite a few years now. I wasn't interested in simply copying. I wanted to create, but I still wanted to get better at drawing, so I still spent plenty of time studying my other fundamentals. But there's a really important thing I failed to realize. When I'm studying, I use plenty of reference, right? But if I don't know how to observe that reference correctly, I'm probably not getting as much out of that practice as I could be. Thinking back, there were so many times I was studying a reference, but making very simple errors, like not realizing something was actually tilted and drawing it straight instead. Which brings us to the next thing we should pay attention to when we're trying to observe. Angles. Obviously, some things aren't perfectly vertical and horizontal. They're often tilted in some way. But by just staring at this angle, it's often not easy to tell exactly how much of an angle it's at. It's a lot easier to figure it out if we draw horizontal or vertical lines next to the line, so we have something to compare it to. Or in the case of a real-life reference, holding the good old pencil up to it again. But that isn't the only use of vertical lines. A plumb line is a type of vertical line you can use to check which line marks line up vertically. And add some text that says plumb line here, please. For example, we can see the chin lines up with the nipple here, and that the top of the fist lines up with the mouth. This is really useful to double check your work to make sure it's as accurate as possible. And of course, you can use horizontal lines to check as well. Remember, the earlier you catch any inaccuracies, the easier it will be to correct them. But what if you have a lot of landmarks you want to check? Drawing a ton of horizontal and vertical lines is kind of a pain. Luckily, there is an easier way to check multiple landmarks: triangles. And what do I mean by that exactly? So sometimes it's hard to tell you got your measurements right when you're measuring along a straight line. But if you find 3 landmarks and draw an imaginary triangle between them, it's a lot easier to check the accuracy of the shape. You can tell if the triangle is too thin or not quite the right shape. I find this particularly handy when drawing faces. For example, you can draw a triangle between the corners of the eyes and the tip of the nose to make sure the relationship between the eyes and the nose is correct. And one more thing. Remember to step back frequently and look at your reference and work from further away. For digital art, that might just simply mean zooming out a bit. Because when you're zoomed in and focusing hard, it can be harder to spot any discrepancies. I hope everything I've been saying so far makes sense. This advice is from a lot of really good artists, much better than I am. Because I kind of have a confession to make, which is that I haven't been entirely honest with you. The reason that we draw envelopes and simple shapes between landmarks is that it's easier to check that they're accurate, right? And that's not true for me. I actually find it much harder. I guess that kind of makes sense because I have no practice doing that at all. But wait, if you look back at some of my previous work, it isn't really that bad, right? How did I manage this without knowing how to observe? Well, I think it was because I was relying on digital art as a bit of a crutch. I was using digital tools to fix things afterwards rather than measuring correctly to begin with. For example, using the liquefy tool to nudge things into place, or the lasso tool to move them. This isn't necessarily bad because I end up getting okay results, but because I had these digital tools, I never actually developed the ability or habit to carefully observe a reference because I knew I could always fix it later if I got it wrong. So it means it's time for me to practice. I started by doing this figure drawing. So what next? How do I know if I did a good job with it? Fortunately, it's not too difficult if you're copying a photo, like what I was doing. You can simply take your drawing and try to line it up on top of your reference and see where you weren't accurate. I tried it and, oh, wow. I can see how I really didn't get the overall shape quite right. But still, a drawing doesn't need to be 100% accurate. If I wanted to do that, I could simply take a photo. But it's still useful for me to check because I can see what kind of mistakes I tend to make, so I can be more mindful of them in the future. For example, for figure drawing, I notice that I generally tend to draw the head too small. And honestly, figure drawing is pretty difficult anyway, so what if I start with something simpler, like this still life? But when I checked my work again, I noticed I also had a tendency to draw things a bit wider than they actually are. So I also have to keep that in mind while I keep practicing. And this is why drawing from photos is great. Because we can check our work ourselves. So does that mean that there's no reason to draw from life entirely? Well, not quite, because for starters, drawing from life is actually a lot harder. First of all, there's a few things you have to remember when you draw from life. Since this is a 3D object that exists in space, you have to make sure that you're always viewing it from the same angle so that the reference doesn't change. That also means that when you measure, you have to really make sure that you lock your arm and hold your pencil perpendicular to the subject so that you can measure consistently. But more crucially, I think seeing the real physical 3D object is important because you get more of a sense of the real 3D form and figuring out how to translate that into a 2D image. With photograph reference, that part has already been done for you. So it can be pretty easy to fall into the trap of simply copying 2D shapes instead of really understanding the underlying 3D forms, and I know this because I fell into this trap for the longest time. Now that I've done some practice and I'm aware of some of my bad habits, let's see if I can draw this portrait more accurately. It seemed to be going pretty smoothly at first, but that's when I realized I had made a huge mistake. Can you see it? In the reference photo, the girl is clearly turned to the side slightly, but in my drawing, she's looking straight at the camera. This is exactly what I meant when I said my observation skills are very weak. I just don't tend to notice these kinds of things. I tried my best to avoid using digital tools like liquefy and lasso, but I couldn't help it, just a little. And after adding a little bit of shading, here's how it turned out. Honestly, it's not the worst. The facial proportions aren't too far off, although the hair is pretty inaccurate, but I think it was better than my previous attempts, so I'm gonna keep working at it. I hope this video was helpful to you too, and thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed it, consider measuring and drawing the subscribe button, and I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye!